everyone, and welcome to The Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. What happens when we die? Do we ever really die at all? Maybe our physical form. But what about the law of the conservation of energy? That energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Rather, it can only be transformed or transferred from one form to another. And then there's residual energy. Maybe you've had an experience where you felt something good or bad when entering a room, touching an object. You aren't sure why you felt that way, but you did feel it. Energy. Is it possible, even if for only brief moments in time, we're able to capture this energy, use the energy to somehow speak with the dead, or for the dead to speak with the living? Tonight, I invite you to explore these thoughts as we dive into the experiences of others. So, let's get started, shall we? When I was about 12 or 13 years old, my friends and I had slumber parties, and we were really into graveyards, Ouija boards, and seances. I always loved spooky, scary horror stuff, and I wanted to see if I really concentrated on making contact, would anything happen? I had one friend at the slumber party who agreed with me, so we tried doing a seance just by ourselves. We were both holding hands and calling out for a ghost, the Blue Lady, to contact us or give us a sign they were present. And I felt something pinch me, not hard, but pinched me enough for there to be a red mark on my forearm. I asked my friend if she'd done it. Our eyes were closed when we were concentrating and chanting. And she said no, but I didn't quite believe her. I was suspicious, but a little freaked out if it wasn't her. So we told the rest of our friends at the slumber party. There were about 12 girls altogether, and they called bullshit and wanted to see us try again in front of them. I wanted to prove that it was my friend playing a prank on me because she was swearing that she didn't do anything to leave a mark. Well, my friend and I both sat there, holding hands again and chanting for the spirit to contact us, to give us a sign. Within about a minute, I went into full body convulsions, and I couldn't stop shaking. My friend let go of my hand, and all of my friends ran away from me, screaming, and they hid under the pool table in the game room that we were in. I finally stopped shaking when I fell backwards on the floor. I sat up and I saw all of my terrified friends hiding under the pool table, and realized I was sobbing and gasping hysterically. At this point, all of us were crying and freaking out. I just wanted to go home. It was about 10 o'clock at night, so we went to call my parents for them to come and get me and take me home. But the phone was dead. My friend's parents had gone to a dinner party and they weren't back yet. So until my friend's parents got home, we all huddled together under the pool table and kept checking the phone line. Still dead. Everyone kept asking me to tell them that I faked it just to scare them. But I couldn't, because I didn't fake it. When my friend's parents got home, we told them what happened, and they calmed us down. The phone line was surprisingly not dead anymore, even though we had continuously checked it until her parents had gotten home. This was the 1980s, and we only had landlines, no cell phones. Since it was already midnight by this time, my friend's dad told us to try to go to sleep, but that he would take me home if anything else happened that scared us again. Nothing else happened, but to this day, I can't explain what that experience was. I've never done another seance or used a Ouija board, since that night in the 80s, even though I still have my mom's packed away in my grandma's cedar chest. I've never had anything else happen like that, so if anyone can offer me an explanation, I would be grateful. My grandfather had gone into the hospital on a Friday night. Nothing too unusual. He wasn't doing good, but he'd been there before. The next day, I go to work, and I'm somewhat worried, but again, he'd been there before. I go on with my day, there's customers, a friend stops by, and we talk. And I fill the rest of the time with homework. My grandfather is in the back of my mind, but I have other stuff going on, you know? Right around 4 o'clock, I was chatting with a coworker when I glanced at the clock and my stomach dropped. I randomly got filled with dread and profound sadness. I continue chatting, but the feeling persists. I check out at 5, the feeling of gloom persisting, and of course, my brain goes to my grandfather. I just knew. I get home, and my mother tells me that my grandfather passed away. I ask around what time. 4 o'clock. Some background. I was 15 when this happened, and I lived in a house with an upper floor and a complete basement. The staircase to the second floor had no doors at either end. The staircase to the basement only had a door at the entrance, the first floor. Both staircases were L-shaped and had landings separating the turns. The space where the staircases met was as large as 2 door frames smushed together. At the time, my mom was busy working on her computer on the second floor, and my dad was running an errand, but I didn't know that piece of info until he got home. There was a doppelganger posing as my dad. To avoid confusion, I will refer to it as him in my story. My dad will be Dad. So here's the actual story. I went downstairs to the first floor to probably get some water or a snack. I don't remember. As I approached the last few stairs, I caught him exit the basement. He was standing on the hardwood floor of the first floor, only a step away from the door. Being the nice daughter I was, I went to say hi instead of doing my task. As I approached him, he went back down the stairs of the basement in a familiar pace. He wasn't rushed or anything like that when he descended the stairs. Him didn't say a single word to me. I was confused, but thought nothing of it. I followed him, but I stopped by the doorframe. At this point, he had traveled a few steps from the door. Him kept eye contact with me, but angled his body in a way that made sure he wouldn't fall. I was in the process of saying hey to him until I was struck by electricity. This electricity felt raw and alluring, though. It felt sour and so very wrong as it pulsed throughout my body. But it didn't belong in this universe, but not in an evil sense. This electricity had only lasted for a second or two before fading. For whatever reason, I couldn't stop talking. It was like my off switch was broken. I knew that I didn't need to fear him, despite that electricity. Maybe that was why I blathered on. Who knows? I certainly didn't. As I continued to talk, our eye contact never broke. Then, I hear my mom yelling down to me. "Who are you talking to?" she asks. I yelled back up, "I'm talking to Dad." After a few moments, I hear my mom walking down to the landing of the staircase leading to the second floor. She told me that Dad was on an errand. Just wanted to remind you that my eyes remained on him while I talked to my mom. Him eventually reached the landing and had his entire body facing me. Then my brain finally began registering what my mom had said. Though that was short-lived when I heard my dad thumping up the stairs to our porch. My mom was walking the rest of the way down and asked me again who I was talking to. Since she was closer, I looked up to her to respond until I heard the doorknob twist. I looked out to the front door, then turned to face my mom and said, "See, I was talking to Dad," or something along those lines. Coincidentally, my dad had just entered the door when my mom had made it to the first floor. The doppelganger was nowhere in sight when I turned my attention back to the landing. My dad looked so confused as to what I said and my mom's stare. Then I quickly went back upstairs, worried about having to explain myself further. That never happened, but I was still very confused about what had just happened. Sometime between my blathering and my conversation with my mom, I was sitting on the floor instead of standing. I also swear that I saw something like worry or surprise register on him after the electricity. It may have also been wishful thinking. I swear to you guys that this is a true story, and I remember it in vivid detail, as you could probably tell by reading. I also wanted to add that the doppelganger was in a recognizable outfit, a thick, long green and white jersey with faded jeans. My dad wore this outfit often, especially during the winter. My dad was in some sort of long-sleeved red t-shirt and lightly worn jeans when I saw him. This has never happened before or since, though I would like to say that the doppelganger loves to taunt me from time to time. There are occasions when I hear my parents' voices off in the distance, then been told that they were on some sort of errands. Sadly, I don't have evidence of it being the doppelganger or a ghost or something else entirely. Have you guys ever come face to face with a doppelganger? I was about 6 or 7 when my mom took me on a hike through some random national park. I know that it was in California, but that's about it. What I remember most is walking through this part that was completely covered in trees, so much so that it made it seem like it was dark outside. As we were walking, I heard someone behind me laugh. It was a child's laugh, and as I turned around, I expected to see another kid, like me. Instead, I saw a little girl. She was a little smaller than me, but she looked almost glowing, and not like a person I'd ever seen. I could see her features, her clothing, her hair, but it's like she was all one color. I tugged on my mom's arm, asking her who was the girl. She turned around to look, but said she didn't see a little girl. And as she said that, I saw the girl sort of disappear as she ran away with the same laugh that she'd greeted me with. When my mother was alive, we didn't really get along. She'd struggled with substance abuse most of her life, including when I was a child, and who knows, maybe even when she was pregnant with me. Overall, she tried, but she was trying while addicted to heroin. So this basically just meant that she was destined to hurt me and herself over and over again. This pattern resulted in me doing my own thing when I became of age to do so. I moved out before I was even 18, and I never lived with her again. She would still ask me for money, and sometimes she would need to stay with me temporarily. But we managed like this for a while. By the time I was in my early 20s, she was in a treatment program in Burien. It was near where we lived at the time. But she'd been in this same program many times before, and this time, I wasn't willing to stick around again and waste my life. I'd managed to make my way to Portland, Oregon, while she remained in Washington. Most of the time, she would call to guilt trip me, asking for money, or asking me to come home. Sometimes, when she was high, she would call to tell me how amazing I was. I never felt amazing, though. Usually, when we got off the phone, I felt pretty terrible. It would take me completely distracting myself with something else to get over that bad feeling. In life, I was never comfortable telling people about my mother. In all honesty, I was ashamed. I didn't want someone to associate me with her, and I spent a lot of time in that headspace. One relationship of mine basically ended because I wasn't honest about who my parents were or who my mother was. But part of me always thought that it was because of who or what my mother turned out to be. A couple years after moving to Portland, I was helping a friend move, and it was around noon, maybe 1 in the afternoon, when I got a call on my cell phone. It was my mother. So I stepped away to answer the phone because for some reason I couldn't bring myself to ignore the call. Sometimes I would do that, no problem, just call her later. But this time, I just felt like I had to answer it. She sounded really good, like healthier than I'd heard her sound in a really long time. I told her that. She thanked me, genuinely, and then told me that she was doing great. She said she absolutely loved the ocean and was so happy that she made her way out there. I told her I didn't realize that she'd taken a trip, and I asked her which coast she was at. She laughed and said, "Oh, honey, it's so beautiful. I just love it here. And honey, I love you." She hadn't answered my question, but I was enjoying our talk. She was happy, but it wasn't that manic happy that being high would normally produce. It felt genuine. She told me that she knew I was going to get that new job I applied for, that I was the most qualified and the one they liked the most. I hadn't remembered telling her about the job, but I laughed and said, "Yeah, I guess we'll see." I told her I was helping a friend move, but could I call her tonight? She said she'd appreciate that. Then we said I love you, and that was that. It was the first time in years that I'd gotten off the phone with her and felt peace. I continued helping my friends move through the afternoon, and around 5, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail as I usually do. After finishing up with friends, I decided to head home, and on the way, I listened to the voicemail. It was from a detective at the King County Sheriff's Department. He was calling to inform next of kin regarding my mother's death. It would take almost 3 days before I would piece everything together. Initially and naturally, I was filled with sadness, and as I walked home, I sat on the curb. I listened to the message from the detective a few times, and he mentioned something about this morning. But I knew he couldn't have been right about that part because I'd talked to her in the afternoon. Once I'd gathered myself a bit, I left a message with the detective, explaining that I'd talked to my mom and that I'd be heading to Washington the next day. My mom had died of a drug overdose. She'd been on methadone, but apparently had also gotten a hold of some heroin. The two together are a recipe for disaster. It's unclear if this was intentional. There wasn't a note, but a photo of me as a child was found next to her body. The coroner had listed her time of death at around 3 a.m. that day. Despite what I thought had happened, there was no call from my mom's cell phone to my cell phone on that day. And when I looked at my phone, the call from my mom was on there, but it registered that it was a 1-second phone call. I have no explanation for this experience, but I do keep an open mind. My mother loved the ocean, and she loved me. She was horrible at showing it sometimes, and she could never really afford to actually live by the ocean. But in death, I don't know. It's like she found a way to be happy. I still talk to her all the time, as if she's here with me. And any time my phone rings and no one's on the other line, I like to think that it's her, just checking in. Oh, and she was right. I did end up getting that job after all. In late April 2019, I went on this tour to Ireland, and one of the things that we did was this ghost tour in Killarney. I was very excited as I love ghost tours, and I was ready for something strange to happen to me. One of the guys on the trip, whom I shall call Ty, was actually a practicing witch who grew up in Salem. We met on the tour and remained friends. And I remember him telling me that if something were to happen on this trip, it would be at the Abbey that we were going to. The bus pulls up to our hotel, and it's decked out in creepy decor as a traditional storyteller does his best to creep us out. Then, we pull up to this empty lot at the top of a hill, where another guy says that he'll be taking us down into the valley, as the storyteller won't go down there. I talk with him as we go, chatting about my ghostly experiences and what he thought of all this. He explains that in all the time that he's worked there, he's never seen, felt, or heard a single goddamn thing. However, he also explained that the day he got the job, his friend in the village, who was a white witch, gave him a blessed walking stick, and he never went to work without it. So, that's why. We get to the bottom of the hill, in front of this ancient, crumbling abbey. It's about 500 years old. The guide tells the story of how a bunch of monks were massacred by the English, and 2 of them were tortured because they held the secret of the abbey's treasure, which have yet to be found. We step inside, and immediately, I can feel all the energy of the spirits around me. I can almost see them passing around me, leaving us be. Then we move to the inner courtyard, where there's this massive yew tree, as old as the abbey around it. The guide explains that the tree is cursed, so that if you touch it, you'll die in a year and a day, and even he refused to go near it. However, both me and Ty agreed that the tree felt so sad, and we both had a very strong urge to go comfort it. It was also at this time that I felt very remorseful, and I had the image of 2 monks, we were not shown any pictures, and thought, I'm sorry I couldn't protect you, which was not my own thought. After this, we went into a side room, and as soon as we did, I knew there was something just chilling in the far dark corner of the ceiling, and there was something evil staring at us from outside. The guide explained that the dark corner was a hotspot for orbs, but I wasn't really listening because I was so focused on staring down the thing in the courtyard. I see its outline in my head, and it was staring me down too. I felt like I had to let it know that I was watching it, that it couldn't come inside and hurt us, that we were safe. The next stop was the most active part of the Abbey, which had been hyped up all night. The plan was for all of us, about 30, to stand with our backs to the walls and have the lights turn off for 60 seconds. They'd been jump scaring us all night. The storyteller did show up in a cloak and ran at us down a dark hallway. And in response, I shoved my friends out of the way and stood in his path. But they wanted us to truly experience the weirdness of this room. The moment I stepped foot inside the room, I felt like there was a weight on my shoulders. I got a lot colder, and I was much, much sadder. It got to the point where our guide for the main trip actually asked if I was okay, but I assured him I was, because I didn't want to miss out on this. So we lined up against the wall, and I ended up with a girl on my right and nothing on my left, with a window above me. Now, it's pitch black outside, and there are industrial lights in the room. Once everybody is ready, they count down and turn off the lights. The second the lights turned off, I started sobbing. I felt like I was mourning for every person I had ever lost, and that everything was just grief. But you know how when you cry, you can't think straight because your emotions take over? Well, mentally, I was fine. I knew that whatever was making me cry wasn't me. So I kept quiet, so as not to disturb anyone else, and I stayed put. I also noticed a young spirit sitting on my left shoulder, and several shadow figures passing in front of me. For the last 20 seconds or so, one of them stared me down. I don't know why, but he didn't like me being there. Yes, I know it was a he, and no, I don't know how. Finally, the lights come back on, and I stopped crying. Totally fine. Everything vanishes as everyone starts filing out, and Ty approaches me and tells me that he noticed all of the spirits around me, and he specifically talks about the young spirit on my shoulder before I tell him. We talk about that, and we come to the conclusion that one of the spirits used my body as a vessel to cry. The next and final stop on the tour is the outdoor courtyard graveyard, where there was something purely evil. I could feel the anger and the desire to hurt when we stepped outside. I pointed it out to Ty, saying that there was something watching us from the dark spot above the doorway. This man literally said, "I know, it's best to ignore it." The storyteller at this point is goofing around, scaring one of the kids because he's easy. But I kept getting really frustrated to the point where I wanted to punch him. And if you know me, you know that's not like me at all. I just wanted to get out of there. Finally, we take the path of the spirits out of the graveyard and back to the bus. Ty and I talk to the guide and the storyteller, who are interested in what happened to us. And they explain that lots of psychics and witches from all over have come and experienced things like us. We thank them as we get back onto the bus. I text my friends and tell them everything that happened, in case I forgot something later. Then, we all go into town and get drunk because we're in Ireland, duh. I've told this story a handful of times to friends, and it never fails to weird them out. So, I thought I'd post it here. See what happens with that. Several years ago, when I had just turned 16, my younger sister and I, who was 13 at the time, decided one evening that we would go get ice cream, since I could now drive us. We lived in a rural area, so in order to get to the Dairy Queen, we had to drive about 20 minutes. There were several ways to get there, but I chose the more secluded route that went through the country roads because it was quicker. I ended up regretting that because it was dark out and foggy and generally creepy. It was not well lit because of it being a rural road with hardly any streetlights. Well, I end up hitting a deer because it's very common in the area that I live in for deer to be out and about and to run right out in front of you. On top of the fog, I just didn't see it. It had also just rained a lot, so the sides of the road were very muddy. I pulled over, very shaken up, of course, and end up getting stuck in the mud on the side of the road. Now, remember, this is a secluded road with hardly any streetlights and just a few houses spread apart. I called my parents so that they could come and get us, but of course, it would be about 15 minutes or so until they would arrive. I had my flashers on, and we see a pair of headlights pull up behind us. I knew that it couldn't be our parents because it was too soon. Suddenly, on the driver's side door appears this older man smoking a cigarette and knocking on my window. I couldn't see his face entirely due to the darkness, but even so, I immediately got a creepy vibe from him. But I didn't think it was bad enough to straight up try to ignore the guy. I roll the window down just a crack, and he asks if we were okay and if we need help. At first I thought it was okay because he didn't seem too creepy. But after we said that we were waiting for our parents to come, he got more anxious. He kept trying to hurry and get us to get out of the car and to go wait in his car, and he became more demanding. Now, we were just 16 and 13 years old, and we didn't have anything to defend ourselves with. I couldn't drive away because my car was too stuck in the mud on the side of the road. So if he tried to drag us out of the car or something, we wouldn't have any way to defend ourselves besides kicking and screaming and hoping that someone would hear it. Suddenly, a light from the porch of the house across the street flicks on, and they come out to see what's going on, since there is a random car in front of their house. This spooks the guy enough, and he takes off in his truck. Finally, our parents get there and the sheriff to make sure everything is okay. But at this point, we were both crying scared because of the accident and the creepy old dude. In hindsight, it could have been nothing, but I'm just glad that I watched enough murder shows and podcasts to know not to get out when someone demands it, and not to get into a random old fellow's truck. Not everyone has that instinct. This happened to me in 2008. It was the year that my grandpa died. To be more specific, this event happened just after my grandpa's funeral. I had asked my parents if it was okay to go to my friend's house, and given that it had been a pretty sad week, they agreed. My friend and I were making popcorn in her kitchen, getting ready to go downstairs and watch music videos like we did on most days. Both of her parents were gone, so it was just us, and the phone rang. My friend didn't answer it, not immediately. I asked if she was going to get that. She sort of laughed, saying that she usually doesn't, but then after the third ring, she answered the phone. She looked at me, made some funny faces, and then waved for me to come over to the phone. It was one that was connected to the wall, and the cord wouldn't have reached me. So I walked over and I leaned in. Static, just noise really, but you could hear something underneath the static, maybe a man's voice. I didn't put it together right away, Just kept listening to the voice and the static.
Love you, B.
Is all that came through clearly. At which time my friend made a face, looked at me, and said into the receiver, "What?" Laughed and hung up. I wasn't laughing, though. Somehow I'd started to well up with tears. I didn't want to be crying, but there I was. The voice that said, "Love you, B." I was pretty sure that was my grandpa. I was also pretty sure that he got cut off and that he would have said, "Love you, BB," which is my nickname amongst family. I told my friend, and she was immediately supportive. She ran to the office where the caller ID was to check it. The call that had just come through didn't even register on the caller ID. It didn't say unknown or private. It just wasn't there. It was like the call never happened. But of course, we knew that it did. This happened when I was 17 years old, back in 2006. I'd been living with my aunt at the time in California, working at her post-production studio and taking care of my cousins. My parents and the majority of our family lived in Washington, including my Uncle Kurt, who had just moved there recently with his future wife and stepson. I like to believe I'm close with everyone in my family, meaning I can usually sense when things are off, when someone needs to talk, stuff like that. I consider myself an empath, so with family or close friends, if I'm near them, I can typically feel their emotions. But this night, July 7th, 2006, something different happened. I was sitting in my aunt's living room, and we were having a great time, laughing and watching the show Psych. Suddenly, and I do mean suddenly, my eyes are filled with tears and my heart feels like it had sank to the bottom of my stomach. I look at my aunt and she's sort of half laughing and half saying, "Oh no, what's wrong?" Then my uncle, her husband, looks at me and does the same thing. Staring at both of them, I try to explain that I have no idea why I'm feeling so sad all of a sudden. I even start to almost laugh a little about how crazy it is that I'm feeling this way right now during such a funny show. I composed myself a bit, but then my aunt's cell phone rang. It was my brother, calling from my mom's phone. I didn't hear what he said, but I saw my aunt drop to her knees and then drop the phone. I rushed over to console her and to grab the phone, and unfortunate for him, I asked my brother to tell me what he just told my aunt. Through tears, he told me that Uncle Kurt had been hit by a drunk driver while walking home. He told me that someone, not the driver that hit him, but somebody else, had stopped to help Kurt, but that he died at the scene before ambulances arrived. Even writing this, I'm refilled with that crazy, intense emotion that I felt that night. I know it was somehow our connection that allowed me to feel that from such a distance. As heartbreaking as this whole experience was, I'm grateful for the experience. My life totally changed after that moment. I don't know what all of it means, but it's wild. I'd end up moving back to Washington after the funeral, and just a couple of years later, working at the same place as the woman who'd stopped to try to save my uncle's life that night. It was so great to get to reconnect with someone like that. And if that's not all great enough, I'd go on to meet the love of my life back in Washington too. And later, through getting to know one another, I'd come to find out that his very first elementary school girlfriend was none other than the woman who'd stopped to try to save my uncle that night. I thought it fitting that this woman be someone that everyone seemed to know and love. Kurt was one of those people that everyone loved and everyone knew. He was born premature and legally blind, so he didn't drive a car. But because of this, he spent a lot of time walking from place to place, making friends with the local gas station attendants, grocery workers, bartenders, people of all sorts. Basically, blind or not, he also appreciated a pretty woman, inside and out. So I know that even if he wasn't ready to leave all of us, he probably went out with a smile on his face, being held in the arms of a pretty girl. I'm also so grateful that he didn't die alone, and that ultimately he brought me home. Well, friends, it would appear we've reached the end of the darkest hour. A huge thank you to everyone who shared their stories, and to everyone for listening. Be sure to join me every Friday night at 11 p.m. on the Darkest Hour YouTube channel. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com. And check out our subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. And if you want to keep listening to the show and you never want it to end, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Stay spooky.